I was out of balance on my phone, and I didn't know what my mother was about to tell me when our call abruptly ended. I felt restless and uneasy. As I waited for her to call back, I couldn't help but wonder what important news she had. But the call never came. Frustrated, I decided to borrow my father-in-law's phone. When I entered his room, I found him glued to his phone screen. He seemed completely absorbed, as if the whole world around him didn't exist. I hesitated for a moment before asking, "Can I borrow your phone for just a moment?" My sudden request startled him. He nearly jumped out of his seat, his reaction so unexpected that it left me rattled. I couldn't understand why he was so startled. Was he hiding something? When I repeated my request, he quickly refused. "I'm in the middle of something important," he said, his voice firm. I was taken aback by his tone. Why couldn't he let me use it for just 2 minutes? It wasn't like I was going to snoop or do anything intrusive. I left the room feeling a mix of anger and humiliation. What could possibly be so private that he had to react that way? As I lay in my bed later that night, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. Part of me felt he was looking at something he didn't want me to see. But then again, he was a pious man, someone who prayed 5 times a day without fail. Could such a person really have something to hide? I shook my head, scolding myself for letting such thoughts cross my mind. I decided to push away those doubts and move on. Later that evening, my mother's call finally came through. Hearing her voice brought me a great sense of relief. Whatever she had wanted to share wasn't as urgent as I'd feared, and I was able to put my unease to rest, at least for a while. That night, as I lay asleep, the door to our bedroom creaked open. My father-in-law entered, his phone charger in hand. This wasn't the first time he'd come into our room at night to charge his phone, but it always startled me. My husband lay fast asleep beside me, unaware of his father's nightly visits. Each time my father-in-law entered, I felt a pang of discomfort. Why did he have to come into our room every night to charge his phone? Surely there were other outlets in the house he could use. I tried not to overthink it, but the visits began to bother me. Sometimes I'd wake up just as he walked in, other times I'd only notice after he'd left. He'd plug in his phone, leave for a while, and then return later to retrieve it. I couldn't bring myself to mention it to my husband at first, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it up. When I asked him, my husband brushed it off. "It's just an excuse to come check on me," he explained. "He's been like that ever since I was a kid. My father cares deeply for me and just wants to see me at night. Don't worry about it." Although his explanation seemed reasonable, it still felt strange to me. I nodded along, trying to convince myself that he was right, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I began sleeping more cautiously, making sure my clothes were properly arranged before I fell asleep. I didn't want to risk any awkward moments or give my father-in-law a reason to linger longer than necessary. Despite my efforts to let it go, I still found myself lying awake some nights, listening for the sound of the door creaking open. I kept telling myself that his actions were harmless, that his intentions were pure. But the unease lingered, a faint but persistent whisper at the back of my mind. I always wrapped myself tightly in a sheet before sleeping, but each morning I'd wake up to find the sheet lying on the floor and my clothes disheveled. It was puzzling and deeply unsettling. It became a recurring pattern. Every night I would tuck myself in carefully, only to discover the next morning that the sheet had somehow slipped off and my attire was no longer as it had been when I went to bed. Worse, I couldn't explain why this was happening. Adding to my discomfort was the presence of my father-in-law. Each night he'd come into the room to charge his phone, something I found odd since there were other outlets available. I could never understand why he specifically chose our bedroom. What unsettled me even more was that I'd wake up feeling as though someone had touched me. Sometimes I thought it was a bad dream, but the sensation lingered. When I glanced around, I'd often see my father-in-law standing nearby. He would usually mutter something about being properly covered while sleeping, suggesting that uncovered women attracted impure forces. His comments left me confused and embarrassed, and I couldn't bring myself to ask for a clearer explanation. Despite feeling increasingly uneasy, I didn't mention this to my husband. I feared he might dismiss my concerns, accusing me of creating unnecessary drama or trying to turn him against his father. I tried to brush off my suspicions, convincing myself it was all in my head, yet the strange occurrences continued. One night, after tossing and turning for hours, I finally fell into a restless sleep. Suddenly, I woke with a start. I could have sworn I felt someone's hand on me. My heart raced as I looked around the dim room. My father-in-law stood close by, his presence making me freeze in place. Before I could even utter a word, he stepped back and said, "You should keep yourself covered when you sleep. It's not appropriate for girls to sleep uncovered. Impure forces can become attracted to them." I was mortified. What was he doing so close to me in the middle of the night? His words sounded like a warning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. When I tried to explain myself, he cut me off, saying, "There's no need for excuses. Just be more careful from now on." I started staying up late, refusing to sleep until I was certain my father-in-law had come and gone. Yet night after night, I found myself succumbing to exhaustion, and each time I'd wake up to the same unsettling scenario. I couldn't figure out what was happening or why he was lingering so close to me. I began to question everything. Was my father-in-law's late-night presence a simple coincidence? Or was there something more sinister at play? I thought about his phone, which he never seemed to part with during the day. He always carried it around, the screen glued to his face, yet he would leave it charging in our room at night. What could be so secretive that he needed to keep his phone so close? I considered checking it just to put my mind at ease, but I held back. I didn't want to violate his privacy, nor did I want to risk angering him or my husband. Even so, doubt began to creep into my mind. What if my father-in-law's behavior wasn't as innocent as I wanted to believe? Was he deliberately entering the room after I had fallen asleep? The thought made my stomach churn. I tried convincing myself that I was being paranoid, that this man, a pious, prayerful individual, wouldn't dare do anything inappropriate. Still, the uneasiness persisted. One night, as I lay awake waiting for him to leave, I must have dozed off again. When I opened my eyes, I found him standing over me once more. His proximity startled me, and I quickly sat up. This time, he repeated his usual advice about staying covered. I nodded silently, but my mind raced. Why did he keep hovering near my bed? Why didn't he simply plug in his phone and leave? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I thought of discussing this with my husband, but I knew he would brush it off. He'd likely accuse me of stirring up trouble. So I said nothing, trying to keep peace in the house. Still, the doubts lingered, making me question my father-in-law's motives. His constant presence, the odd phone charging routine, and his peculiar behavior all added to my growing suspicion. My father-in-law didn't respond when I called out to him. Curious and uneasy, I picked up his phone. The screen was unlocked, and as I scrolled, I stumbled upon some strange videos. For a moment, I thought I saw my own face in one of them. Before I could process what I was looking at or try to call someone, he suddenly appeared. He snatched the phone from my hands, his face filled with anger. "You shouldn't be touching someone else's phone without permission," he said sharply. His tone startled me, and I immediately apologized. I told him I was just trying to call my mom. He cut me off, saying, "I don't have any balance on my phone either, so you can't make any calls." Feeling humiliated, I returned to my room. My thoughts raced. Why did he react so strongly? There was no need to get so angry over a simple phone call. More importantly, what was he hiding? Why had it seemed, if only for a moment, like my face was in one of those videos? Had I imagined it, or was there something there? I decided that when he came to plug in his phone at night, I would look again. Sure enough, that night, he left his phone to charge as usual and then walked away. Knowing he would be gone for at least half an hour, I waited until I heard him leave the room. Then I quickly grabbed the phone and opened the gallery. What I found made my blood run cold. There, among the videos, were recordings of my husband and me, private, intimate moments that were never meant to be seen by anyone else. My hands began to tremble, and I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath me. I flashed back to my childhood. I'd been so young when my father passed away. My mother had moved us to my grandmother's house, and I had grown up watching her grieve. She had loved my father dearly, and his sudden loss had left her devastated. Even as a child, I could sense the depth of her sorrow. When I was old enough to understand, I asked my mother why she never remarried. She always said the same thing. "I can't imagine a new husband accepting you fully." I've seen too many stories of men mistreating their stepchildren. Some refuse to support them, others treat them as less than their own. I'd rather stay alone than put you in harm's way. Over time, my grandparents passed away, leaving my mother to fend for herself. She was educated and resourceful, and through the help of a friend, she found a teaching position at a government school. Our lives became more stable. She took care of me with a fierce devotion. When I was at school, she would worry about my safety until I was home again. I could see her relief whenever I walked through the door. When I finished my studies, my mother arranged a marriage for me after careful consideration. She wanted me to have a safe and stable future. The man she chose seemed respectful, and his home was quiet, just him and his father. There were no extended family members to complicate matters. At first, I believed I had entered a peaceful, steady environment. But as time went on, I started noticing subtle, disquieting things about my father-in-law. He was too attached to his phone, always glued to it. Even when he was alone in his room, he seemed obsessed. And every night, without fail, he would come into our room to charge it. Why couldn't he charge it in his own room? I had brushed off these thoughts until the day I opened his gallery. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. It all felt so wrong, so invasive, yet I was afraid to confront him. I worried that if I spoke out, no one would believe me. Or worse, that I would be blamed for even touching his phone. As I sat alone in my room that night, I tried to make sense of everything. I thought about my mother's cautious approach to life, her refusal to remarry because she feared the unknown. In her own way, she had protected me from the possibility of ending up in a harmful environment. Yet here I was, faced with a situation I couldn't have imagined. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confide in my husband. What if he turned against me? But the longer I stayed silent, the more I felt trapped. My father-in-law's presence loomed over me. Even his simple act of walking into the room to charge his phone made me uneasy now. My once peaceful home had become a place of tension and fear. My mother always said that most problems in a home stem from mothers-in-law or sisters-in-law. Since my new home included only my husband and father-in-law, she assured me that I would have no issues. I believed her. After all, my husband treated me with the utmost care and respect. He never raised his voice at me, always spoke gently, and was patient. I adored him for his kindness and love. The idea of any tension or strife in our home seemed unthinkable. Yet my father-in-law's behavior was puzzling. At times, he would look at me with a gaze that made me uncomfortable. His eyes lingered longer than they should, and I started to notice that he would occasionally brush against me in ways that felt off. These were not blatant acts, but enough to leave me unsettled. I didn't know how to address these moments or even whom to confide in. My mother, who was always worried about me, would become deeply anxious at the slightest hint of trouble. I feared that if I told her about these incidents, she would fall ill from the stress. For that reason, I chose to stay silent. I tried to dismiss it all as paranoia, convinced myself I was overthinking. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. But then one day, I happened to come across his phone. I wasn't snooping, I just needed to borrow it. When I unlocked it, I was met with something that froze me in place. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The videos. There was no mistaking it. They involved me and my husband, our private moments somehow recorded. My blood ran cold. As I stood there, horrified, I heard the faint creak of the door. My father-in-law was returning. I quickly turned off the phone and set it down. When he walked in, he immediately noticed me near his phone. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he walked over, picked up the phone, and left the room. His silence was almost worse than any words. It was as though he knew I had seen something I shouldn't, and his calm departure only added to my fear and confusion. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confront my husband without proof, and even if I did have proof, how could I tell him? This was his father we were talking about. How could I expect him to believe that the man who raised him could do such a thing? I knew my husband loved his father dearly and saw him as a figure beyond reproach. Without concrete evidence, I was certain that any accusations would only lead to conflict and possibly even tear my marriage apart. From that day on, my father-in-law became more guarded with his phone. He no longer left it unattended. He started charging it in his own room away from prying eyes. It was clear he suspected that I had seen something, and he was determined to keep me from accessing it again. My husband even noticed the change and asked me about it. I feigned ignorance, brushing it off as nothing. I wasn't ready to reveal what I had discovered. Without proof, it felt like opening a Pandora's box. One day, my husband directly confronted his father about why he had stopped charging his phone in our room. I didn't know what my father in law told him, but when my husband returned, his demeanor had shifted. He was angry. As soon as he entered our bedroom, he started yelling at me. How could you disrespect my father like that? He's like a father to you too. You have no right to treat him poorly. His accusations hit me like a slap. I tried to explain, but he cut me off. My father said you accused him of disturbing your privacy. Is that true? Did you tell him not to come into our room at night? I shook my head, denying it. No, I never said anything like that. But he wouldn't believe me. So now you're calling him a liar? His voice was louder now, filled with anger and disbelief. Are you telling me my father made this up? I was at a loss for words. I wanted to scream the truth, that the man he so admired wasn't who he thought he was, but I couldn't. I knew how much he revered his father. To him, his father was above suspicion, a man of integrity. If I accused his father without solid evidence, I feared it would only drive a wedge between us and leave me isolated in this house. Days turned into weeks, and the tension lingered. My father-in-law avoided me as much as possible, and I did the same. Every time I passed him in the hallway, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I could see it in his eyes, the knowledge that I had seen those videos. He didn't say anything directly, but his silence was loud. It was as if we were playing a silent, dangerous game where neither of us could make the first move. My husband, on the other hand, seemed increasingly frustrated with me. He couldn't understand why I appeared distant or why the atmosphere at home felt so strained. He blamed me for creating a rift between him and his father. No matter how much I tried to act normal, the weight of what I had seen and the knowledge that my husband might never believe me was always there. I wanted to tell him everything, to show him the truth, but I knew I only had one chance to do it right. Until then, I had to endure the growing distance between us and the silent tension that hung over the house. I began to dread each passing day, knowing I was living with a secret that could destroy my family. The trust between me and my husband was eroding, and my father-in-law's presence loomed like a dark cloud. My mind raced with questions. How long had he been doing this? Why? And most importantly, how could I prove the truth without shattering everything? As my husband's anger simmered, I felt as if the walls were closing in around me. His temper was something I hadn't experienced before, and the fact that it was directed at me made it all the more jarring. His face was flushed, his voice was loud, and his accusations cut deeply. He firmly believed the lies my father-in-law had told him, and no amount of explaining seemed to make a difference. I stood there, unable to say much of anything, while my husband paced back and forth. His words were harsh, but I couldn't blame him. After all, he had no idea what was really happening. To him, I was questioning his father's integrity, and that was unacceptable. But the truth was far more complicated. If I told him the full extent of what his father had done, without solid proof, I was certain he would never believe me. Worse, I feared he might kick me out or even end our marriage. I resolved to find some sort of evidence. Without it, I was trapped, powerless to speak up. But gaining that proof was no easy task. My father-in-law was careful, constantly keeping his phone within arm's reach. Even when he went to the bathroom, he made sure it was locked and secured. On a few occasions, I did manage to get my hands on his phone while he was away, but it was always locked. The password kept me from uncovering what I knew was hidden inside. Each failed attempt only increased my frustration. Meanwhile, my father-in-law's behavior became bolder. He no longer tried to mask his intentions. During the day when my husband was at work, he began making more blatant advances. Sometimes it was a lingering touch on my hand as I handed him a cup of tea. Other times it was an excuse to stand closer than necessary. I felt cornered in my own home. There was no escape. I became increasingly withdrawn, afraid to leave my room when he was around. I jumped at every sound, worried it was him approaching. I started going to my mother's house more often, seeking solace. Her kind words and familiar presence were the only things that kept me sane. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full story. She was already so protective of me. I couldn't bear to see her fall apart knowing the truth. Instead, I made vague excuses about feeling unwell. My mother would look at me with concern, offering me advice and telling me to take care of myself. Her love and concern only made me feel more alone because I couldn't tell her what was really weighing on my mind. When I returned home that evening, I was met with my husband's rage. He accused me of neglecting his father. He said that my repeated trips to my mother's house were unacceptable. I didn't marry you so you could run back to your parents' house every other day, he shouted. I married you so you could take care of my father in his old age. I stood there in silence, tears streaming down my face. How could I explain to him that his father, the man he respected and trusted, was the very reason I was seeking refuge elsewhere? How could I tell him that his father had been harassing me, making me feel unsafe in my own home? The thought of my husband's disbelief, or worse, his anger, kept me from saying anything. With no one to turn to, I tried to avoid my father-in-law as much as possible. I focused on housework, keeping myself busy so I wouldn't have to be near him. After finishing my chores, I would lock myself in my room and pray that the door wouldn't open. But my father-in-law wouldn't leave me alone. He began knocking on my door late at night, demanding that I let him in. Each knock sent shivers down my spine. I sat in silence, crying quietly, pleading with God to protect me. The constant fear began to wear me down. One day, as I was cleaning the living room, my father-in-law came up behind me and grabbed my hand. My heart stopped. He didn't say a word, just pulled me toward the bedroom. I resisted, pulling back as hard as I could, but he was stronger. I screamed and struggled, begging him to let me go. He ignored my pleas and continued dragging me down the hallway. The sound of my protests echoed through the house, but there was no one there to hear them. As we reached the bedroom, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I knew what was coming. I braced myself, squeezing my eyes shut, and prayed that something, anything, would stop him. In my mind, I saw my mother's face, heard her voice telling me to stay strong, to have faith. I clung to that thought, even as I felt my father-in-law's grip tighten on my wrist. When my husband came home that day and witnessed the scene unfolding before him, it was as though the world had stopped. His expression was unreadable. He looked as if he had been struck by lightning. I stood frozen, tears streaming down my face, feeling utterly helpless. He didn't say a word to me or to his father. Instead, he turned around, and in that moment, it was as if he were trying to process what he had just seen. I don't know how long we stood in silence before he finally moved. When he did, it was not to comfort me or confront his father. It was as if he needed to get away to think. He left me standing there, my emotions raw and my body trembling. It felt as though my entire world was crumbling around me. I thought he would speak, that he would ask for an explanation, but no such questions came. When my husband's silence finally broke, it wasn't in the way I had hoped. Instead of offering me words of comfort, he simply said, "Let's go," and he led me out of the house. I followed, unsure of where we were going, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't explain anything as we left the house and made our way to my mother's home. Once there, he dropped me off without so much as an explanation or a goodbye. My mother, upon seeing my tear-streaked face, became frantic with worry. She bombarded me with questions, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything at first. I was too shaken, too unsure of how to even put into words what had happened. When I finally managed to speak, I told her everything. I described how my father-in-law's actions had escalated over time, how he had tried to harm me, and how my husband had witnessed it all. My mother was speechless, her hands trembling as she held mine. The look in her eyes told me that she was just as shocked and horrified as I was. But my biggest fear wasn't just what had happened. It was the possibility that my husband might believe his father's lies. I knew my father-in-law well. He was skilled at twisting the truth. He would paint himself as the victim, and my husband might see me as the liar. I couldn't shake the fear that without concrete proof, I would be the one cast out, labeled as deceitful. I called my husband repeatedly, sending messages begging him to talk to me, to let me explain, but he never answered. My mother tried to console me, assuring me that my husband was a reasonable man. "He'll come around," she said. "He just needs time to sort this out. Don't lose hope." I wanted to believe her words, but the days stretched into weeks, and each passing moment without hearing from my husband only deepened my despair. Then, one day, he came back for me. When I saw him at my mother's door, I hardly recognized him. He looked tired, defeated, as though the weight of the world was resting on his shoulders. Without saying much, he took me to a small apartment. I was confused, unsure of what was happening. "Why have you brought me here?" I asked, unable to hide my bewilderment. He sighed deeply and said, "This is where you'll live now." His words stunned me. I couldn't understand why we were leaving the home we had shared, and I asked him, "What about your father? Who's going to take care of him?" He hesitated before answering, "I've arranged for him to marry a widow. She'll look after him from now on. You don't need to worry about him anymore." His response was a relief, even though it didn't fully sink in at first. The thought of no longer having to live under the same roof as my father-in-law was liberating. The constant tension and fear that had haunted me were finally lifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that life might return to some semblance of normalcy. Later that evening, as we settled into the new apartment, I felt compelled to tell my husband the truth. I needed him to know why I had been so distant and afraid. I took a deep breath and began, "See, there's something you need to know about your father. I saw something on his phone that—" My voice faltered, but I pushed on. "He was recording us. He would leave his phone in our room on record whenever he went to charge it. I discovered those videos by accident." I watched as the color drained from my husband's face. He sat there, silently absorbing my words, and then closed his eyes. His expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "I never thought my father would do something like this," he said. "It's unthinkable, unforgivable." I placed my hand gently on his. "I didn't know how to tell you before. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." He shook his head slowly, as if trying to make sense of it all. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "My father, he always taught me about respect, about doing what's right, but he—" His voice trailed off, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I could see how much this revelation hurt him. His trust in his father was shattered, and I knew he would need time to process everything. But in that moment, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had finally told him the truth, and he believed me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. "Let's move forward," he said finally. "We'll start fresh. You don't need to carry this burden anymore." He squeezed my hand gently, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of security. I knew we had a long road ahead, but we would face it together.